Thank you, Hugh. And thank you for inviting me this afternoon. I have to say, I'm so delighted to be here. It's my first visit, but I've heard so much about this fabulous space from my students. Excuse me. So it's a thrill, actually, to be here. I have to say, in the first place, it feels very strange to be talking about myself, because for so long, if I've strove to speak about anything, it's going to be about music, about my students, maybe occasionally about my family. But here I am, and it's very interesting for me now to ponder on and share my thoughts about so many interesting things that have happened in my life. It's extraordinary how we are all at the mercy of the great unknown. The fact is, we spend our lives witnessing situations with people where their particular journey has taken them in a totally different direction to the journey they imagined. And it's so important, and I talk about this constantly, how we, each of us, have to be prepared for the unknown and to learn how to cope and to surrender to whatever life allots us. I chose to open with this particular recording of the Brahms variations, Opus 21, number 1, the opening theme, as this work has in fact changed the course of my life in recent years. Until just a couple of years ago, I was happily dedicating my professional life to all my wonderful students at the Royal College of Music, London masterclasses, and my own private studio. And out of the blue, I received an invitation from the Japanese recording company Soneto Classics, telling me that they would love me to consider recording for them. Apparently, they'd heard this particular Brahms work, the recording on YouTube, and were that impressed that they felt they wanted to approach me. Of course, I was very flattered and, coming completely out of the blue, very surprised, but I had to inform them that I'm no longer performing, and of course more of that later. But I agreed, we had some discussions about this, and I agreed to allow them to reissue some of my early BBC recordings. They were happy to do that, and after some superb, I have to say truly superb, remastering on their part, we now have 2 volumes of Norma Fisher at the BBC, and I have to say I am more than thrilled at how well they've been received. Many people have asked, why didn't this happen earlier? As most of the recordings date from the 1970s, 80s. And I can only say, truly, that my life took me in another direction, and I actually stopped thinking about myself. It needed, as I suppose it always does need, an outside source to divert one's attention back, and that's exactly what happened with me. Suddenly, I was back in the position of thinking about myself as the pianist, as the concert artist. And thrilling is, I don't have a word to describe that feeling. So I have all my thanks, of course, to Sonetto Classics for this wonderful happening in my life. So before I start my story, the pivotal points of my story, of course, because I can't give it to you all much as I'd like. But at this point, I'd like to play another track from Volume 1, this time an etude by Scriabin, the Scriabin Etude Opus 42, number 5, which I think demonstrates the excitement, the exhilaration that existed in those early years when anything and everything was possible, and set my world on its particular axis. It all started at Hampton Court. Why Hampton Court? That's where I was born. The palace housed a maternity hospital during the Second World War, and that's where I actually made my first appearance. My parents had come to London soon after the First World War. My father from Vilnius in Lithuania, or Vilna in Russia, as it was then, and my mother came from Skierniewice, just outside Warsaw. Both families escaping from the pogroms, which was such a terrifying threat to so many at that time. My mother's family were the musical ones, and it was her interest and passion for music that was responsible for the education of all her children. I had an older brother and sister who were almost teenagers and already passionate about music, but their love was Italian opera. And I grew up, the first sounds I actually ever heard were the extraordinary voices of Gigli, Tagliavini, Bioling, Silveri, and so many other great, great, extraordinary voices. And this love of the operatic voice has remained with me to this day, and certainly influences my need to find the perfect singing line in almost everything I or anyone else plays. My earliest childhood memories connect also with the family's general record collection. A lot of Tchaikovsky, a lot of Borodin, a lot of Mendelssohn, a lot of Rossini, Holst, The Planets, which I adored is not the word. And I recall moments as a tiny tot, I can only have been 2 or 3 years old, burying my head, I can still feel it, burying my head in the lounge curtains and sobbing uncontrollably. How do you explain that? A baby. The piano was an irresistible piece of furniture in our lounge that caught my attention as soon as I could reach the keys. Once I found myself there, nothing mattered. I had no need for dolls, no need for toys. I had a piano, and that became my sole source of entertainment and fun. It was very much the center of our family life, and my older sister had played, was being taught when I started, but it's told, of course I don't know, it's said that when I started, she actually stopped. It seems that my interest in the instrument made my mother think about having me taught, and there was an elderly lady, lived close by, who said she would take me on. Fine, I loved her, I loved the lessons, but I was absolutely petrified of her dog. She had a yapping terrier, and I froze at the sight of this animal. I'm sure it's not hatred, but my fear of dogs to this day stems from that. And poor woman would have to sit on the animal in order that I could continue with my lessons. This, of course, my parents felt couldn't continue, and so another teacher had to be found. And we found actually, through a friend of a friend, another chance happening, wonderful chance happening. Wonderful German lady called Else Schumann, who took me on and was exactly right for me at that stage. She understood completely what I needed. And by the age of 11, I had been through all the exams through to grade 8, winning silver and gold medals at all the local festivals. And she felt it was time for me to try Guildhall School of Music as a junior exhibitioner, to audition for them, which is exactly what I did. And again, I was so incredibly lucky because on the adjudicating panel was Sidney Harrison himself, and he came over to me, put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You will study with me." It was an instant decision, and it was the right one, because he again was exactly what I needed at that stage. We adored each other, and I couldn't wait for my weekly lessons at Guildhall, and I would go to his home close by here in Chiswick, he lived. My progress was, I have to say, extraordinary when I look at the works that I played with him in those early years. I mean, through all the Chopin ballades and etudes, the Brahms B-flat, piano concerto, that is, Brahms rhapsodies. I mean, it was, I could not get enough. And he saw that, appreciated it, and was thrilled also with my progress. But he would constantly talk about a woman, a pianist, a foreign-sounding name meant nothing to me as a little girl. He would say always, "You remind me so much of this woman I heard during the war in Egypt." And of course I was very flattered that he should compare me with a famous pianist, but I still had no idea who she was. Until one day I happened to be with my mother on a bus going past the Royal Albert Hall, and there on one of the posters, one of the billboards, was the name Gina Bacher. And I said to my mother, "This is the woman, the pianist, Sidney Harrison is constantly comparing me to. Can we please go to hear her?" Which of course we did. She played the Tchaikovsky First Piano Concerto. And I was so thrilled and asked my mother if we could go back to see her for an autograph. We went, and Gina very happily welcomed me into her room. It doesn't always happen as easily as that. And I don't know where it came from, but I looked up at her and I said, "My teacher says I played just like you." She was extraordinary. I mean, she had a smile that would set the world on fire, but she looked at me, she smiled, and she said, "Really? In that case, I would love to hear you." And within days, I was visiting her at her home in Highgate, her magnificent home. She lived in the home of Lady Crossfield, a very famous house called Wittenhurst. All the Wimbledon, the pre-Wimbledon tennis parties used to be held there. I don't know whether you remember that. Anyway, it was superb. And she welcomed me and obviously wanted to hear me play. I had to prove that I played like her. I recall playing her the Chopin F minor Fantasy, the Brahms Piano Concerto, and I have to say she was very happy with what she heard and called in her husband, Alex Sherman, the conductor, to hear me, because she said she wanted very much to help me, to be there for me. And how could we proceed? Of course, I had to go back to Sidney Harrison and explain all of this. I felt terribly badly about it because he had become like a father figure. And it was difficult, but he understood and he was very happy for me. In fact, I'm just going to backtrack because before actually meeting Gina, I was first of all a junior exhibitioner at Guildhall, and then I was taken away from school. That in itself was a huge drama because I was a student where I took the 11 plus exam and I won a place at the prestigious Godolphin and Latimer, which again is a local school here. I'm a West London girl, actually, altogether. So I went to Godolphin and Latimer, and of course loved it very much, except I was very much aware of the fact the school was not too happy with the amount of time I was spending at the piano. And here we were now approaching the equivalent of GCSE years, and Sidney Harrison was very, very concerned about my staying on for those couple of years because he felt it would take away from my work at the piano. So he arranged to see the headmistress, Dame Joan Joyce Bishop, who was none too pleased, of course, because I'd been given a special place at this academic school and expected to continue on to university. And that was obviously not going to happen. And so I didn't have her blessing when I left. In fact, a few years ago, I went back to visit my old school, Godolphin, and told them the story, and they were actually very amused. I'm very happy after all these years that I could actually show my face there again. But yes, so I became a full-time student at the age of 14 at Guildhall, and it was at exactly that point that I met Gina Bacher as well. So I spent a year at Guildhall as a full-time student, and then Gina's idea was that I should study with the legendary Ilona Kabos. Wonderful, but how was that going to happen? Because it was obvious my parents were not in a position to pay for such an education. But Gina said to me, don't worry, we will organize all of that. I will take you to see the lady who has been my patron throughout, and I'm sure she will look after you. And this wonderful lady, her name was Clarissa Davidson, saw me together with her twin brother, Fred. They were at the time also looking after Rosalind Turek, Daniel Barenboim, heady days actually. And I was absolutely thrilled when they agreed that if Ilona Kabos was prepared to take me on, they would take care of they would pay for my lessons, they would look after me in general, they would become my patrons. So we reached the point where I had to audition for Ilona Kabos, and we would then see how things would proceed. The great day came. I waltzed into this lady's studio, little girl full of energy, full of hope. And Ilona heard me play. Again, I recall so clearly, I played for her the Brahms F minor sonata, the third piano sonata, and the Rachmaninoff Paganini variations. And she said straight away she would take me on. The only thing she was concerned about is whether I was psychologically fit to study with her. I had no idea what she meant. I mean, I protested that I worked hard, I practiced all the hours of day and night if necessary. But of course, she knew what she was talking about. And I came to understand pretty quickly what she was talking about as well, because her demands, nobody had ever made those demands of me. I had always sailed through whatever I played. I could just play anything. I didn't have to think, I could just play. And with Sidney Harrison, I was allowed to do just that. He adored sitting back and just listening to me. But it was obvious that there was more needed. And Ilona was looking for something that was just more than just sitting at the piano and playing and having a good time. A lot more thought had to be required. And we started talking about sound and how to develop and how to listen and how to find sound and how to understand. And I was completely tortured by this, knocked sideways, in fact. And for a couple of years, I really could not put two notes together. I went into a terrible depression. Fortunately, I was still a teenager. But it was frightening for me, it was frightening for my parents, it was frightening for all those people who had who were so enthusiastic about what I did. The 2 years passed. The years went on forever, but they passed, and there was a dawning. The light dawned in the way it never had before, and suddenly I understood what putting your hands on the keys, producing sound, finding sound, communicating through that sound, what that was all about. And I have, much as they were incredibly difficult years, I have to thank her for everything. And while we're talking about her, while I'm talking about her, and we're thinking about her, I would like to play a track from my second volume. Amongst other things, I play the inventions of André Tchaikovsky, the extraordinary Polish pianist and composer who was a great friend. And amongst the inventions, each invention depicts a different person, but the third invention is Ilona Kabos. And it is exactly Ilona Kabos. You can feel the energy, the spirit, the defiance, the no-nonsense. And in fact, you will hear Ilona Kabos, Ilona Kabos. If you listen carefully, it's all about listening. Thank you. I hope you heard it. Ilona Kabos, undeniable. So I then continued with her for many years. I grew up with her, truly grew up with her. And those years were filled with the most extraordinary music making, meeting wonderful performers, young and old. Her house was full of great artists, and I was unbelievably privileged as a young teenager, 15, 16 years old, to rub shoulders with the likes of Rosalind Turek, Belashiki, André Foldish, Shura Tchaikovsky, and very importantly, Annie Fisher. And Annie Fisher became an enormous example in my life. And I felt very guilty because, of course, Gina Bachar had done so much for me, and I worshipped her. And I felt disloyal that here should be another woman coming into my life to whom I became so devoted. We met for the first time when Ilona Kabos asked me if I would help her because she was playing in London for the first time and she was making her debut with the Brahms Second Piano Concerto, which of course I'd played since I was 13, 14 years old. So I was to help Annie Fisher, to work with her, to play second piano, the orchestral part, and just be there for her, point out anything she was missing. If you can imagine such a thing, when I think back now, absolutely extraordinary. But anyway, I'm happy to say she made the most incredible debut, and of course, I don't think you can speak to a pianist or pianophile anywhere who doesn't worship her playing, as do I to this day. We have the same name, spelled differently, of course, and we're completely different roots, but I'm so, so proud of the fact that she was so much a part of my life. Ilona was also tough as she was incredibly generous. And I was constantly being sent to play to different pianists. If ever there was a great pianist visiting London, Claudio Arau, Eugene Istomin, Schubert, Tchaikovsky, if they were visiting, I would be sent to play to them. And again, if you can imagine how important those influences, those meetings were, and another reason to be so hugely grateful to Ilona, her generosity. There are not too many teachers who would do that. Teachers become so possessive of their students. But she was trusting, she knew of our relationship, and she understood how important it was also for me to pick up ideas and to be influenced by these people. I reached the age of 17, and the time has come for me to audition for the BBC. It doesn't happen today. We live in a completely different world. But in those days, if you played for the BBC, you had to audition. And they were tough, but somehow I was lucky. And at the age of 17, I made my debut in a series called The Rising Generation, very much like today's new generation artists. I remember that first recital, which was live. Today, everything is recorded. It was live. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. And I started with a Schumann toccata. If you can imagine such a thing, when I think about it now, the courage. The Schumann toccata, the Liszt F minor transcendental etude, and the Stravinsky sonata. That was my debut for the BBC, The Rising Generation. And soon after that, I was invited to audition for the Brahms. That in itself is another very important story, which I will continue with if I move in chronological order. But the audition for the Brahms was fascinating in that I was invited to play, I had to play 2 contrasting concertos or movements, and together with the second pianist. It was on the platform at the Royal Albert Hall. I arrived not a soul in sight, apart from the woman who took me onto the stage and led me off the stage. I played two B-flat concertos. I played the first movement of the Tchaikovsky B-flat and the last movement of the Brahms B-flat. Had no idea how it was received. As I say, I saw nobody. Went home, and I went back to Clarissa Davidson. I remember that actually now very clearly. The telephone rang, and it was the BBC, to say that I apparently passed the audition successfully, and they wanted me to play at the first night of the proms. That was just extraordinary. You can imagine how thrilled Ilona, Gina, Clarissa, everybody was with this news. However, before that, I was actually invited to Germany because they had heard my BBC, the first BBC recordings, and they invited me to take part in a series for Rias, the radio station in Berlin, called Rias stellt vor, which is Rias introduces. So I made my debut there for Rias, for the radio station, although I had previously been to Berlin because I was selected or invited to represent the UK at the Jeunesse Musicale conference in Berlin. And I played a recital. That was my first experience of being on German soil. But here I was back at the Rias radio station, obviously an important event in my life. And again, it was successful, and I was straight away engaged to play the Chopin Second Piano Concerto with the Berlin Symphony Orchestra. Wonderful event. I mean, obviously a few months later, this didn't happen one day after another, but it was, again, I'm happy to say, very successful, wonderfully reviewed, and word started to get around, and invitations then came from every part of the world, and my career was truly launched. It was vital at that time, of course, to have an agent. And for those of you who remember the agent situation at that time, there were actually two who were major on the music scene. That was Ibsen Tillet and Wilfried van Wyk. And it was Wilfried van Wyk who took me on. And he took over my life. I traveled everywhere, playing everywhere. I mean, to go into all the places I visited, although I have to say that while traveling the world, I was constantly in Germany. Germany, I have to say, almost became a second home. You know, I played recitals, chamber music, concertos, an incredibly exciting time. And what I'd like to do at this point is just to play another track, this again from my second volume, just with Germany in mind. It is the arrangement of Schubert's Hark, Hark, the Lark, the arrangement by Liszt. Thank you. thinking about the Lark taking flight, Ilona felt that this was now the time for me to think about an international competition. The competition scene then was very different to now. There were not that many, but there was the great Queen Elizabeth of the Belgians in Brussels. There was the Busoni. But Ilona felt that my first competition should be in Brussels, of all places. Again, when I think about it, with no experience at all of the competition scene, I was there. Together at that time with so many well-known names. Marta Argerich was there, that's where I met her for the first time. And in fact, she retired from the competition for whatever reason, but that typical Marta. But many other pianists who today are household names, nobody got through the first stage. I don't want to mention names. I didn't, but they didn't either. Nobody got through. It was the Russians who won everything. Because the Moscow Conservatoire at that time, nobody could compete. And if the Russians came, nobody stood a chance. So that was my first experience of competitions. But in actual fact, it did me a power of good, because I always say competitions are not about winning. I say to my students so often, if you go to a competition to win, don't go, because that's not what they're about. But anyway, it was a great experience for me, and soon after, I went to the Busoni competition in Bolzano, which was a completely different energy. I mean, a great energy, but very different to Brussels. And I was lucky enough to win second prize there, which again was going to offer all sorts of wonderful concerts, wonderful openings, wonderful possibilities. And one of these superb things that came out of that particular competition was meeting Sir William Glock, who was then the head of the BBC Music. He was on the jury, and he loved my Stravinsky sonata. And he said to me, I want you to play that for Stravinsky himself. And that meeting was arranged in London, and I met with a great man, and that in itself is a story. I could spend all day talking about it, but as we're talking about pivotal points at the moment, let's leave it there. It was an extraordinary event in my life, and another one to add to the growing list of extraordinary events. Another thing that came out of Brussels, interestingly enough, even though, and it just goes to show that you don't have to win at a competition, but on the jury at the Queen Elizabeth of Belgians was Harriet Cohen. And apparently she liked my playing enough to award me the Harriet Cohen International Medal for Pianists, which actually I shared that particular year together with Vladimir Ashkenazy. So that is something I look on with great pride. And again, I didn't win that competition. I didn't get past the first stage, but I was awarded this tremendous honor. And again, so much to be grateful for. But now going back to my proms, my very first prom was meant to be the first night of the proms, and it didn't work out. I could show you, if I had them here, the number of different contracts, because that first prom became, for whatever reason, I don't know, so complicated. But it wasn't the first night of the proms. Can't remember which night exactly it was, but I played the Liszt second piano concerto with the LPO, with the London Philharmonic Orchestra, and was subsequently invited back the next year. I played Saint-Saens Symphonic Variations. And the year after, in fact, 2 years running, the second Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto, the first time with Sir Malcolm Sargent, which was actually televised and was thrilling beyond belief. I think it was one of his last concerts, actually. And he was such a darling. He was so sweet, so warm, so helpful. But I do remember I had a friend who played tuba in the orchestra, and he said to me, came to me after the concert, he said, "Norma, do you know, you didn't once look at the conductor." How Malcolm Sargent was able to control you, I don't, because he watched you, but you didn't watch him. You were in a world of your own. However, I don't recall that at all, except I just remember the joy of making music with him. And the following year, I played the same concerto with the BBC Northern Orchestra and George Hurst. And then the next year, I played the Grieg Piano Concerto with Colin Davis conducting and the LSO, London Symphony Orchestra. And that actually was a momentous time in my life because I had met my husband and my life was changing forever. It was an extraordinary thing. My Ilona, Kabos, and even Gina Baha were very, very concerned about my getting hitched because they felt that it would detract. But of course, it was not the case. But it was wonderful to be able to share that first prom with a husband. And soon after that, we actually had our first child. But in fact, when I was pregnant with the first child, I was 8 months pregnant at the time, don't be shocked. But I had been invited to Germany. I had 3 consecutive performances of the Tchaikovsky Piano Concerto. The invitation had come way before I was pregnant, and I became pregnant. And what do you do when you're 8 months pregnant and you have to perform the Tchaikovsky Piano Concerto 3 times? You do it. My husband tried to stop me. My mother tried to stop me. The doctors were happy because I was fine and I was happy to go. But I think the conductor, the orchestras, the audiences, because I do recall a gasp as this heavily pregnant lady came on to play. But we got through, and when I think about it now, it was an achievement. I don't think I've ever seen a pregnant woman perform, certainly not the Tchaikovsky. But I have an extraordinary story to tell about that because our son, who was born soon after, when he was 13 years old, won a music scholarship to Clifton, left home, and was incredibly happy there. But during the first couple of weeks, we had a telephone call from him to say, "Mum, guess what? Something extraordinary has happened because I don't feel homesick, but every time I do feel slightly homesick, I found a wonderful piece of music that actually helps me." What was that piece of music? The Tchaikovsky Piano Concerto. I relate that story so often because it's so meaningful. But anyway, we had our first son. I had an extraordinary, my husband could not have been more of a mother and father to him so that I could continue with my work. My mother too was always there to help out. And life continued. I traveled, I did everything that I should be doing as a concert artist. Nothing changed. And then we had a second son, and again, things continued swimmingly. And then one day, it was actually just before I was due to play a Mozart concerto at the Royal Festival Hall, that I noticed there was a problem with my hand, that it was not functioning as it should. No pain, nothing that I could actually point a finger at or understand what was going on, but no coordination, and I was terrified. I couldn't understand what was happening at all. The performance took place, thank goodness. Nothing happened during, but I was petrified. And sadly, this started to become more and more of a problem. I consulted doctors, you can imagine, the fear, the agony, the nightmare, that when I put my hands on right hand on the keys, that nothing would happen. My hand just refused to play. And I had no idea until, because at that time, none of the doctors actually understood. I consulted them all. Nobody understood what was the problem. And it was one day that I was reading an American magazine, the Piano Quarterly, International Piano Quarterly. Oh no, then it was called the Piano Quarterly. And there was an article on exactly this problem, which I couldn't believe, called Teaching Hands, Treating Hands, by a neurologist called Frank Wilson. And I could not believe what I was reading, because that was exactly my problem. And I went straight away to see him. He was actually visiting here. He was a resident consultant in California, but was visiting in Germany at the time. So I went over to Hanover, to see him. And he told me, confirmed, that it was in fact a condition called focal dystonia. And not much to do about it. They were then experimenting with Botox injections into different muscles of the arm. But, it is not really being successful. And he told me about Leon Fleischer, about Gary Grafman, about Byron Janis, about Glenn Gould, and sympathized and said, you might be one of the lucky ones that it will disappear. But sadly, much as I would have loved, and you cannot imagine the doctors I saw, but nobody could actually help. And so I had to make the decision, because performing was just too unpredictable with this particular condition. You never know when it's going to strike. And so my performing days had to end. And I had already started teaching because I love to teach. And the teaching, in fact, took over at that point. I had a lot of private students, wonderful students at that time, and loved every minute of the teaching. And so the transition was made quite easily. And then I was invited to teach. I taught for a time at Cheetham School of Music, and then the Royal Northern College of Music, and now at the Royal College of Music. But I also started at the time London Masterclasses, which has been now going for 30 years, very successfully. I joined together with fellow colleagues, the cellist Ralph Kirschbaum, violinist George Pauk, and various singer friends, and we started a yearly course. And it has been absolutely extraordinary, the number of people, the number of wonderful young talents we've been able to encourage, to nurture. So that in itself has been a joy of joys. And I'm not sure how we're doing for time, but I think that what I'd like to say is that looking back on my life, which really I just feel has been so special, there have been so many extraordinary moments, and so many moments which have given me reason to think very seriously about life. Why? And to ask the question, why? Why do these things happen? And I'm very, very much a fatalist and feel that we are all given, this is a learning experience here, and we are all given what we're due, and we have to accept it and go with it. But aside from that, which it was a difficult lesson to take on to begin with, but having accepted that, the joy then, I think as a performer, of course, we share. We're communicating, we're sharing, and that's the essence of performing. But with teaching, the sharing is even more so. And that joy of sharing is something that has just given me so much pleasure over the years. And I just feel with life altogether, you know, that if you can't share, there is no point in living. Life is truly about sharing. As you do here with this wonderful space, you share and you give opportunity to so many wonderful young people. I would like to end this particular session with the last work that I'm going to play today. And I've chosen it. It's from the second volume. It's the Saint-Saens, the extraordinary arrangement, Liszt's extraordinary arrangement of Saint-Saens' Danse, Macabre, which I've chosen it not only because I adore the work and just love what Liszt has to say in it, but because the work itself, the Danse Macabre, expresses the fragility of life. It says, the bell tolls for all of us, and fate takes charge. Thank you.
Well, for once, ladies and gentlemen, I'm lost for words. It's been a very moving afternoon indeed. An extraordinary account of an extraordinary life. And what comes across, in addition to the hair-raising virtuosity, transcendental pianism, is the sheer warmth and humanity and wisdom of this remarkable lady. And I've heard this from so many of her pupils, actually. They all say this is the warmth and the deeper aspects of music that they receive from her. And I find it very humbling to have been here this afternoon to hear an account of this remarkable life. Thank you very much indeed, Norma. It's been memorable. And thank you very much also to our technicians, because it's been slightly more complicated than usual, playing the tracks and having all the sound levels and everything. So I'd like to pay tribute to George Auckland, Peter Sanderson and Truss, our 3 technicians handling this afternoon. And thank you very much for watching. And if you'd like to donate to our concert series and to this wonderful church, you'll find a PayPal facility on our website, which makes it easy for you to do so. We have about 40 concerts now before Christmas, including our big Beethoven Sonata cycle in a month's time, 4 weeks' time in fact, where all 32 pianists are played by 32 32 sonatas played by 32 pianists. It's going to be a special event. And if you want notice of all our concerts, one easy way of doing it is to subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is St Mary's Perivale 2. Anyway, thank you very much for being with us. I have to say it's one of the most remarkable afternoons we've ever had here. So thank you once again, Norma. It's been very special and good afternoon. Thank you.